Today we are going to find out what a chiller is and how a chiller works. In simple words, a chiller is a machine that cools the water, which is then used to cool buildings, schools, etc. Chiller comes in various different shapes and sizes. It all depends on the size of the building, environmental conditions, and economic conditions of the user. Chiller consists of various components, like condenser, evaporator, pumps, refrigerant, etc. Basically, chillers are connected to various AHUs in different rooms. Cool water is pumped from the chiller to AHU, which collects the heat in rooms and exchanges it with cool water from the chiller. Now the water which is returning to the chiller, which is heated in AHUs, has a higher temperature than water entering the chiller. This process is repeated, which cools the entire room. So now the question is, what happens to this high temperature water that enters the chiller from AHU? The heat is transferred from this warm water through refrigerant to condenser. Now, this heated water is pumped to a cooling tower where there is a fan that dissipates and rejects heat from the building. And now, the cool water returns from the cooling tower to the condenser, takes the heat from the refrigerant, and goes back to the cooling tower again. So there are two cycles involved in the entire process. Let's look at what's happening inside the chiller to see how it functions. Every chiller has four main components: evaporator, condenser, compressor, expansion valve. These four are vital elements of the chiller, without which the chiller may not function. Now inside the chiller, there are basically three main circuits, operating for the chiller to function. The first one is the refrigerant loop. This loop consists of the cycle of refrigerant, which passes through all components and transfers heat from evaporator to condenser, as discussed earlier. The second loop consists of water that comes from the building, and goes back to the building, all happening in the evaporator. And the third one is the condenser circuit, in which water is going to the cooling tower and coming back to the chiller, all happening in the condenser. Let's see how these three circuits and four components function. Refrigerant collects heat from water coming from the building in the evaporator circuit and travels to the compressor. The compressor creates static pressure and pushes the refrigerant to the condenser. In the condenser, the refrigerant dumps this heat to the water coming from the cooling tower and travels to the expansion valve. In the expansion valve, the refrigerant is expanded, which gives it more ability to pick the heat in the evaporator. This cycle continues and thus, heat is transferred from warm rooms to the cooling towers, which makes the room cooler.